The mahogany gavel came down with a thunderous crack that echoed through the sterile courtroom, sealing another child's fate with the cold efficiency Judge Harrison Blackwood had perfected over 23 years on the bench. The 12-year-old boy standing before him shifted nervously from one worn sneaker to the other, his oversized jacket hanging loose on his thin frame like a hand-me-down ghost. Judge Blackwood barely glanced up from the case file as he pronounced his decision, his steel-gray eyes scanning legal documents with the same detached precision he might use to review a grocery list. Another foster placement, another broken system shuffling damaged goods from one temporary home to another, another reminder of why he had built walls so high around his heart that even he had forgotten what warmth felt like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Judge Harrison Blackwood straightened his black robes and surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had learned to find purpose in routine. The Superior Court of Riverside County had become his kingdom over the past 2 decades, a place where his word was law and his decisions shaped the trajectories of countless lives. At 58, Harrison carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had never learned to bend, his salt and pepper beard perfectly trimmed, his charcoal suit pressed to crisp perfection beneath his judicial robes. He was a man who measured success in closed cases and efficient dockets, who prided himself on never letting emotion cloud his judgment or sentiment interfere with the cold mathematics of justice. The family court division had been his assignment for the past 8 years, a posting that many of his colleagues considered a form of career purgatory. While other judges handled high-profile criminal cases that made headlines and built reputations, Harrison found himself presiding over custody battles, adoption proceedings, and the endless parade of foster care placements that formed the backbone of the county's overwhelmed child welfare system. He approached these cases with the same methodical detachment he had once brought to corporate litigation, viewing each child as a case number, each placement as a logistical problem to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimum emotional investment. Harrison's personal life reflected the same carefully controlled order that governed his courtroom. He lived alone in a sprawling colonial mansion in the hills overlooking Riverside, a house he had purchased during his marriage 15 years earlier, when he still harbored illusions about family and legacy. The divorce had been finalized a decade ago, a clean legal dissolution that had cost him half his assets, but gained him complete control over his time and space. His ex-wife had wanted children, had pleaded with him to consider adoption when their attempts at biological parenthood had failed, but Harrison had viewed her desires as irrational emotional impulses that would only complicate their perfectly ordered existence. The mansion remained exactly as it had been during their marriage, a showcase of expensive furniture and carefully curated art pieces that created an atmosphere of sophisticated isolation. Harrison employed a housekeeper who came twice a week to maintain the pristine surfaces and a landscaping service that kept the grounds in magazine-perfect condition, but otherwise, the house stood as a monument to successful solitude. He had convinced himself that this was exactly the life he wanted, free from the messy complications of human attachment, unburdened by the unpredictable demands of caring for others. The courtroom where Harrison held his daily sessions was a testament to institutional efficiency, its beige walls and fluorescent lighting designed to process human drama with assembly line precision. Social workers shuffled through with their endless caseloads, foster families appeared for routine check-ins, and children were moved from placement to placement with the mechanical regularity of chess pieces being repositioned on a board. Harrison had developed a reputation among the county's child welfare workers as a judge who made quick decisions, asked few questions, and rarely showed interest in the personal details that complicated the neat categories of his legal universe. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, Harrison's docket included 14 cases, a typical load that would keep him busy until late afternoon. He had arrived at the courthouse at precisely 7:30, as he had every workday for the past 8 years, spending an hour reviewing files and preparing his decisions before the first case was called at 9. His assistant Janet, an efficient woman in her 40s who had learned to anticipate his preferences and protect his time, had organized the files in order of complexity, placing the routine foster care reviews at the beginning of the day when his patience was freshest. The case of Ethan Rivers should have been nothing more than another routine placement review, a 5-minute procedural hearing to formalize the boy's transfer from his current foster home to a new family across town. The 12-year-old had been in the system since he was 7, bouncing between foster families with the weary regularity of someone much older than his years. His file, thick with social worker reports and psychological evaluations, painted a picture of a child who had learned to adapt to new environments with remarkable speed, while maintaining an emotional distance that protected him from the inevitable disappointments of temporary attachments. Ethan's current foster mother, Dorothy Palmer, was requesting his removal not because of any behavioral problems or conflicts, but because her husband had recently lost his job and they could no longer afford to provide care for a foster child. It was a common story in Harrison's courtroom, families whose good intentions were ultimately defeated by economic realities and the crushing financial pressures of modern life. The Palmers had provided Ethan with 18 months of stability, the longest placement he had experienced since entering the system, but now even that modest foundation was crumbling beneath the weight of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The new placement Harrison was reviewing seemed suitable enough on paper. The Morrison family lived in a middle-class neighborhood 30 minutes across town, with 2 biological children and previous experience fostering adolescents. Mrs. Morrison worked as a school administrator, her husband taught high school mathematics, and their home study had received glowing reviews from the placement agency. They had requested an older child specifically, understanding that teenagers in foster care faced unique challenges in finding permanent homes, and they had expressed willingness to provide long-term stability for the right match. Harrison glanced at the clock above the courtroom door and noted with satisfaction that he was running precisely on schedule. The morning's cases had proceeded with the smooth efficiency that marked his well-run courtroom, each decision rendered with the speed and certainty that came from years of experience navigating the system's requirements. He had approved 3 adoption finalizations, authorized 2 emergency removals, and processed 6 routine placement reviews without encountering any complications that might have disrupted his carefully planned timeline. When Janet called Ethan Rivers' case, Harrison looked up from his files to observe the small group gathering before his bench. Dorothy Palmer sat in the front row with her husband, both looking tired and apologetic, their faces bearing the strain of economic stress and the guilt that came from being unable to fulfill their commitment to a child who had already experienced too much instability. The social worker assigned to Ethan's case, a young woman named Sarah Chen who had been handling placements for less than 2 years, stood near the plaintiff's table with a stack of documents and the slightly overwhelmed expression that Harrison had learned to associate with overworked county employees. But it was the boy himself who caught Harrison's attention, not because of anything particularly remarkable about his appearance, but because of the way he carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed unusual for someone his age. Ethan was small for 12, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had clearly been purchased for someone else's child, but he stood with his shoulders straight and his chin raised, meeting Harrison's gaze with the direct honesty of someone who had learned not to expect much from adults, but refused to be diminished by their failures. Harrison had seen hundreds of children pass through his courtroom over the years, most of them bearing the visible scars of neglect, abuse, or abandonment that had brought them into the system's embrace. Some were defiant, angry at a world that had failed them repeatedly, while others had retreated into shells of protective silence that made them seem much older than their chronological ages. A few displayed the artificial brightness of children who had learned to perform happiness as a survival strategy, smiling and chatting with forced enthusiasm while their eyes remained wary and distant. Ethan fell into none of these familiar categories. He appeared neither angry nor withdrawn, neither performing false cheer nor radiating obvious trauma. Instead, he projected a kind of calm acceptance that suggested someone who had made peace with circumstances beyond his control, while maintaining an inner core of strength that had somehow survived intact despite years of institutional instability. Harrison found this composure oddly unsettling, perhaps because it reminded him uncomfortably of his own carefully constructed emotional armor. Sarah Chen approached the bench with Ethan's file and began her standard presentation, summarizing the circumstances that necessitated his placement change and outlining the details of the proposed new home. Her voice carried the slightly rushed quality of someone trying to move through a heavy caseload as efficiently as possible, touching on the relevant facts without delving into personal details that might complicate what should be a straightforward administrative decision. Your Honor, the department recommends placement of Ethan Rivers with the Morrison family, effective immediately. The Morrisons have completed all required training and background checks, and their home study indicates they can provide appropriate care for an adolescent male. The current placement is being terminated due to economic hardship, not behavioral issues or placement breakdown. Harrison nodded and began flipping through the documents in Ethan's file, his eyes scanning social worker reports, school records, and medical information with the practiced efficiency of someone who had reviewed thousands of similar cases. The boy's academic performance was consistently above average despite the disruptions of multiple school changes. His behavior reports were uniformly positive, and his psychological evaluations suggested remarkable resilience for someone who had experienced significant early childhood trauma. One detail in the file caught Harrison's attention, not because it was particularly relevant to the placement decision, but because it seemed oddly specific among the usually generic language of social work documentation. According to a report from his current school, Ethan had been spending his lunch periods in the music room, where he had somehow gained access to an old upright piano that the school used for basic music education. The music teacher had noted that despite having no formal training, Ethan displayed unusual natural ability and had taught himself to play simple melodies by ear. Harrison almost dismissed this information as irrelevant to the legal proceeding at hand, but something about the detail nagged at him. In his experience, children in foster care rarely had opportunities to develop talents or pursue interests that required consistency and long-term commitment. The constant moves between homes and schools disrupted any possibility of sustained learning, leaving most foster children focused on the more immediate challenges of adaptation and survival, rather than the luxury of artistic expression. "Mr. Rivers," Harrison said, addressing Ethan directly for the first time, "I see here that you've been playing piano at your school. Is that correct?" Ethan looked slightly surprised that the judge had noticed such a minor detail from his file, but he nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir, Mrs. Garcia, the music teacher, lets me use the piano during lunch sometimes." Harrison found himself curious despite his usual indifference to such personal details. "And you taught yourself to play?" "Yes, sir."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I just listened to music and tried to figure out how the sounds match up with the keys. It's not really playing like real musicians do, just copying things I hear. There was no false modesty in Ethan's response, just the matter-of-fact honesty of someone stating simple truth. Harrison had been around enough children to recognize the difference between genuine humility and the manipulative self-deprecation that some kids learn to use as a defensive strategy. This boy seemed genuinely unaware that teaching himself to play piano by ear might be considered remarkable by others. "What kind of music do you like to play?" Harrison asked, aware that he was deviating from his usual script, but unable to stop himself from pursuing this unexpected thread of conversation. Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "I like the sad songs best, sir. They seem easier to understand. The happy songs sometimes feel like they're trying too hard, but the sad ones feel true.
The unexpected sophistication of this answer caught Harrison off guard. In his experience, children typically expressed preferences in much simpler terms, liking things because they were fast or slow, loud or quiet, familiar or new. But Ethan had articulated something about emotional authenticity in music that suggested a level of artistic sensitivity that Harrison would not have expected from someone his age, particularly someone whose life circumstances had provided little exposure to cultural refinement. Sarah Chen shifted impatiently near the plaintiff's table, clearly eager to move through the routine proceedings and on to her next case. Dorothy Palmer glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall, probably calculating how much work time she was missing for this administrative formality. The court reporter continued typing with mechanical precision, documenting every word of what should have been a 5-minute procedural hearing that was now stretching into its second quarter hour. But Harrison found himself reluctant to end this unexpected conversation. Something about Ethan's quiet dignity and surprising depth had captured his attention in a way that none of the hundreds of other children who had passed through his courtroom had managed to do. Perhaps it was the boy's calm acceptance of circumstances that reminded Harrison of his own emotional self-control, or perhaps it was the unexpected glimpse of artistic sensitivity that suggested hidden depths beneath the surface of routine case documentation. "Tell me about your current living situation, Mr. Rivers," Harrison said, using the formal address that he applied to all participants in his courtroom regardless of age. "Are you happy with the Palmer family?" Ethan considered the question carefully before responding, and Harrison could see him weighing different possible answers before settling on honest truth. "Mrs. Palmer and Mr. Palmer are kind people, sir. They've been good to me. I understand why they can't keep me anymore, and I don't blame them for it. Sometimes things happen that nobody can control." The mature resignation in Ethan's voice was both impressive and heartbreaking. This 12-year-old spoke about adult disappointment and economic hardship with the philosophical acceptance of someone much older, someone who had learned through repeated experience that emotional attachment was a luxury that circumstances rarely allowed him to maintain for long. "And how do you feel about moving to another new home?" Harrison asked. "I hope the Morrison family will be nice," Ethan said simply. "I try to be helpful and not cause problems, so hopefully it will work out well. If it doesn't, I'll just have to try again somewhere else." The matter-of-fact way Ethan discussed the possibility of another placement failure struck Harrison as both admirable and tragic. This child had developed emotional survival strategies that allowed him to navigate repeated disappointments without becoming bitter or broken, but the cost of that resilience was a kind of premature emotional independence that no 12-year-old should need to develop. Harrison looked down at the placement order on his desk, the standard legal document that would formalize Ethan's transfer to the Morrison family within 48 hours. All he needed to do was sign the paper, make his standard remarks about hoping the placement would be successful, and move on to the next case on his docket. The system would continue its mechanical operation, processing another child through another temporary arrangement that might last months or years before the next inevitable disruption occurred. But instead of reaching for his pen, Harrison found himself studying Ethan's face more carefully. The boy met his gaze with steady composure, waiting patiently for whatever decision the adult authority figure would render about his future. There was no pleading in his expression, no attempt to influence the outcome through charm or manipulation, just quiet acceptance of whatever judgment would be pronounced from the bench. "Mr. Rivers," Harrison said suddenly, "would you consider yourself a talented piano player?" Ethan looked puzzled by the question. "I don't really know, sir. I've never played for anyone except Mrs. Garcia, and she's always encouraging to all the students. I don't have anything to compare myself to." "But you enjoy it?" "Playing piano? Yes, sir. It's the best part of my day, usually. When I'm playing, I can forget about everything else for a while, and just focus on the music. It makes me feel like maybe I'm good at something." The wistful honesty in Ethan's voice triggered something unexpected in Harrison's carefully controlled emotional landscape. For just a moment, he found himself imagining what it would be like to be 12 years old with no permanent home, no family to provide encouragement or support, no one to witness or nurture whatever talents might be struggling to develop under impossible circumstances. Harrison had built his entire adult identity around the principle of emotional detachment, convincing himself that caring too much about individual cases would compromise his ability to make rational decisions for the greater good. He had learned to see the children who appeared before his bench as statistics in a larger system, problems to be solved rather than human beings with unique potentials and unrealized dreams. But something about Ethan's quiet dignity and unexpected depth was penetrating the defensive barriers that Harrison had spent decades constructing. Perhaps it was the boy's remarkable resilience in the face of repeated abandonment, or perhaps it was his touching faith in the possibility of finding meaning through music despite having no real support or training. Whatever the cause, Harrison found himself experiencing an unfamiliar urge to do something more than simply process another routine placement. "Mr. Rivers," Harrison said slowly, "what would you say if I told you that I have a piano at my house? A very nice piano that no one ever plays." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his composed demeanor since entering the courtroom. "That would be wonderful, sir, but I don't understand why you're telling me that." Harrison wasn't entirely sure why he had mentioned it either. The baby grand piano in his living room had been his ex-wife's pride and joy, a beautiful instrument that she had played regularly during their marriage, filling their home with classical music and jazz standards that had provided a soundtrack to what he now remembered as the happiest period of his adult life. Since the divorce, the piano had stood silent and untouched, an expensive piece of furniture that served no purpose beyond filling space in his oversized living room. "What I'm suggesting," Harrison said, aware that he was venturing into completely uncharted territory, "is that perhaps you would benefit from living in a home where you could have regular access to a piano, where you could develop your musical abilities properly." Sarah Chen looked confused by the direction this conversation was taking. Placement decisions were based on practical considerations like safety, stability, and resource availability, not on matching children's interests with potential foster families' recreational amenities. The Morrison family had been selected because they met all the standard criteria for adolescent placement, not because they owned musical instruments or had any particular connection to artistic education. "Your Honor," Sarah Chen interjected gently, "the Morrison placement has already been approved, and they're expecting Ethan this weekend. Their home study doesn't mention any musical instruments, but they've expressed commitment to supporting his interests and activities." Harrison waved away her concerns with an impatient gesture. He was following an impulse that he didn't fully understand himself, but for the first time in years, he felt genuinely engaged by something happening in his courtroom, rather than simply processing it with mechanical efficiency. "Mr. Rivers," Harrison said, focusing his attention entirely on Ethan, "let me ask you a hypothetical question. If you had access to a beautiful piano and could practice every day, how much do you think you could improve your playing in, say, 2 months? Ethan considered this carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I think I could get a lot better, sir. I learn pretty fast when I have time to practice, and I listen to music all the time in my head. If I could practice every day, I bet I could learn some really complicated pieces. Complicated enough to impress someone who knows about music. Someone who might be, shall we say, skeptical about the abilities of a self-taught 12-year-old. I don't know, sir. I'd certainly try my best." Harrison leaned back in his chair and studied Ethan's earnest face. An idea was forming in his mind, something completely unprecedented in his judicial career, something that violated every principle of professional detachment that had guided his decisions for the past 2 decades. It was reckless and impulsive, and probably completely inappropriate, but it felt more alive and meaningful than anything he had done in years. "Mr. Rivers," Harrison said with the slow deliberation of someone making a momentous decision, "I'm going to make you an offer. If you can learn to play piano well enough to truly impress me, well enough to demonstrate genuine musical talent, and not just amateur fumbling, then I will seriously consider adopting you myself." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Sarah Chen's mouth dropped open in shock. Dorothy Palmer gasped audibly from the gallery. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment, as if uncertain whether she had heard correctly. But Ethan's reaction was the most striking of all. For the first time since entering the courtroom, his carefully maintained composure cracked completely. His eyes filled with tears that he tried unsuccessfully to blink away, and his voice broke when he tried to respond. "Do you really mean that, sir? You would really consider adopting me if I could play piano well enough?" Harrison felt his own throat constrict with unexpected emotion. "I mean it completely, Mr. Rivers, but I want to be clear about the terms of this arrangement. I'm not talking about playing chopsticks or simple children's songs. I'm talking about real music, played with genuine skill and artistry. Music that would impress someone who has heard professional performances." "How long would I have, sir?" Harrison thought for a moment. 2 months, 60 days from today. That should be enough time for someone with real talent to demonstrate their abilities, but not so much time that we're prolonging false hope unnecessarily. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and straightened his shoulders, his composure returning as he processed the magnitude of what had just been offered to him. "And where would I live during those 2 months, sir? Would I still go to the Morrison family?" Harrison realized that he hadn't thought through the practical implications of his spontaneous offer. The Morrison family was expecting to receive Ethan for long-term placement, not as a temporary arrangement while he prepared for some kind of musical audition. The entire county foster care system operated on the assumption of stability and permanence, not on judges making arbitrary challenges based on artistic performance. "Actually," Harrison said, making another impulsive decision that would have shocked him if he had been observing from outside himself, "I think the best arrangement would be for you to stay with me during this trial period. That way you would have immediate access to the piano and could practice as much as necessary." If the courtroom had been silent before, it now felt like a vacuum. Sarah Chen looked like she might faint. Dorothy Palmer was staring at Harrison as if he had begun speaking in a foreign language. Even Ethan seemed overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of his circumstances from routine placement transfer to extraordinary personal opportunity. "Your Honor," Sarah Chen said weakly, "I don't think there are any precedents for this kind of arrangement. Judges don't typically provide temporary foster care, and certainly not based on musical competitions." Harrison was well aware that his behavior was completely outside normal judicial protocols. He had built his career on following established procedures and avoiding any appearance of personal involvement in the cases before his bench. What he was proposing violated numerous professional boundaries and would certainly raise questions about his judgment and impartiality. But for the first time in decades, Harrison found himself caring more about doing something meaningful than about maintaining professional appearances. The sight of Ethan's tear-filled eyes and the sound of desperate hope in his voice had awakened something in Harrison that he had thought was permanently buried beneath years of institutional detachment. "Miss Chen," Harrison said with the authoritative tone that had ended countless courtroom debates over the years, "I am a duly licensed foster parent with current certifications and home study approvals. I underwent the complete training process during my marriage when my ex-wife and I were considering adoption. My credentials are all up to date, and my home meets all safety and space requirements for adolescent placement." This was technically true, though Harrison had maintained his foster care credentials more as a bureaucratic formality than from any genuine intention to provide care for children. During his marriage, he and his wife had completed the extensive training and background checks required for prospective adoptive parents, though their divorce had ended those plans before they had ever received a placement. Furthermore, Harrison continued, "I am offering Mr. Rivers an opportunity that is clearly in his best interests, providing him with resources and support that would not be available in a standard placement. The temporary nature of the arrangement protects both parties while allowing him to pursue his obvious musical talents under optimal conditions." Ethan was staring at Harrison with an expression of wonder and disbelief, as if the judge had just offered him something beyond his wildest dreams. Which, in a sense, was exactly what had happened. After years of moving between temporary homes where he was always a guest, always aware of his provisional status, he was being offered the possibility of permanence with someone who seemed to see potential in him that no other adult had recognized. "Your Honor," Ethan said softly, "I would be honored to accept your challenge. I promise I will work harder than I've ever worked at anything. I won't let you down." Harrison felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror at what he had just committed himself to. In the space of 20 minutes, he had transformed from a detached judicial administrator into someone who had just taken personal responsibility for a vulnerable child's future. He had no idea how to be a guardian or mentor, no experience with adolescent care, no understanding of what it meant to nurture someone else's dreams. But looking at Ethan's face, seeing the hope and determination blazing in the boy's eyes, Harrison felt more alive and purposeful than he had in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever professional consequences he might face for his unprecedented decision, he knew that he had just made the first genuinely meaningful choice of his judicial career. "Very well then, Mr. Rivers," Harrison said formally, reaching for his gavel. "Court is adjourned. We'll reconvene in 60 days to hear your performance and determine your future accordingly." The gavel came down with the same authority that had marked thousands of previous decisions, but this time Harrison felt the weight of genuine consequence behind the sound. For the first time in his career, he had made a ruling that would require him to invest personally in its outcome, a decision that would demand everything he had to give, rather than simply processing another case through the system's mechanical operations. As the courtroom began to empty, Harrison found himself alone with Ethan, who was still standing near the plaintiff's table, as if uncertain whether the extraordinary events of the past hour had really occurred. The boy looked small and vulnerable in the large, formal space, but his eyes held a determination that suggested he understood the magnitude of the opportunity he had just been given. "Rivers," Harrison said, stepping down from the bench and approaching Ethan directly for the first time, "I want you to understand something very clearly. This arrangement is not a guarantee of adoption. It's an opportunity for you to demonstrate your capabilities, and for both of us to determine whether we might be compatible as a family. Do you understand the difference?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. I understand that I have to earn it. But I also understand that you're giving me a chance that nobody has ever given me before. Even if it doesn't work out, I'll always be grateful that you believed I might have something worth developing." The maturity and grace of Ethan's response confirmed Harrison's instinctive sense that this boy was extraordinary in ways that the foster care system had never recognized or nurtured. Here was a child who understood both opportunity and risk, who could accept uncertainty while committing himself completely to pursuing an unlikely dream. "We should probably go to my house and get you settled," Harrison said, realizing that he had no idea how to transition from formal judicial proceedings to informal domestic arrangements. "You'll need to see your room and the piano, and we should discuss practice schedules and expectations." As they walked together toward the courtroom exit, Harrison found himself wondering what his ex-wife would think if she could see him now. She had always accused him of being emotionally unavailable, of hiding behind his professional role to avoid the messy complications of genuine human connection. She had left him because she wanted children and family, and all the unpredictable joys and sorrows that came with caring deeply about other people's welfare. Now at 58, Harrison was about to discover whether he had any capacity for the kind of nurturing that child-rearing required. He was about to find out whether his carefully controlled life had room for the chaos and vulnerability that came with taking responsibility for someone else's dreams and disappointments. But as he looked down at Ethan walking beside him, Harrison felt something that might have been excitement mixed with his terror. For the first time in decades, he was embarking on something completely unknown, something that would require him to grow and change rather than simply maintaining the status quo of professional competence. The next 60 days would determine not only whether Ethan could develop his musical abilities sufficiently to impress a skeptical judge, but whether Harrison Blackwood could develop the emotional capabilities necessary to become the kind of man worthy of being called father. It was a challenge that would test them both in ways neither could fully anticipate, a leap of faith that might end in disappointment for both parties, or might transform them both into people they had never imagined they could become. The drive to Harrison's house took them through the winding roads that separated the commercial district from the residential hills, where Riverside County's most successful professionals had built their sanctuaries from the chaos of their working lives. Ethan sat silently in the passenger seat of Harrison's black Mercedes, his small hands folded in his lap as he stared out the window at neighborhoods that seemed to exist in a different universe from the modest apartments and cramped foster homes that had shaped his understanding of domestic life. Harrison found himself stealing glances at the boy as they navigated the familiar route he had driven alone thousands of times over the past decade. Ethan's profile revealed a kind of quiet concentration, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of this journey that might be taking him toward a completely different kind of future. The judge realized with uncomfortable clarity that he had no idea how to make conversation with a 12-year-old, no framework for the casual interactions that would be necessary if they were going to share living space for the next 2 months. The silence in the car felt weighted with unspoken questions and uncertainties. Harrison had made his dramatic offer in the heat of an unexpected moment, driven by impulses he didn't fully understand, but now he was confronting the practical reality of what he had committed himself to. He knew nothing about adolescent care, nothing about creating an environment where a traumatized child might feel safe enough to pursue ambitious dreams, nothing about the daily rhythms and routines that would be necessary to support Ethan's musical development. When they turned into Harrison's circular driveway, Ethan's eyes widened as he took in the sprawling colonial mansion with its perfectly manicured grounds and imposing stone facade. The house had been designed to project success and stability, its traditional architecture and expensive landscaping creating an atmosphere of old-money refinement that Harrison had thought would impress colleagues and clients. Now seeing it through Ethan's eyes, he wondered whether the imposing grandeur might feel intimidating rather than welcoming to a child who had never experienced anything approaching this level of domestic luxury. "This is where you live?" Ethan asked softly as Harrison pulled into the 3-car garage that had never housed more than his single vehicle. "This is where we live," Harrison corrected, though the words felt strange and unfamiliar in his mouth. He had thought of the house as his private domain for so long that the idea of sharing it with another person required a fundamental shift in perspective that he wasn't sure he was capable of making. Inside the house, Ethan stood in the marble-floored entryway and slowly turned in a complete circle, taking in the soaring ceiling, crystal chandelier, and formal staircase that curved upward toward the 2nd floor. Harrison tried to see the space through the boy's eyes, noting details that his own familiarity had rendered invisible. The pristine surfaces, expensive artwork and museum-like atmosphere that had once satisfied his desire for order and control now seemed cold and sterile, lacking any warmth or personal character that might make a child feel at home. "The piano is in the living room," Harrison said, leading Ethan through the formal dining room and into the large open space that served as the house's social center. The baby grand piano sat in the corner like a beautiful sculpture, its polished black surface reflecting the afternoon light that streamed through tall windows overlooking the garden. Ethan approached the instrument with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. He stood beside the bench for a long moment before reaching out to touch the keys with one finger, producing a single clear note that seemed to hang in the air like a prayer. The sound filled the room with a resonance that Harrison had not heard since his ex-wife's departure, a voice that awakened memories of evenings when music had provided a soundtrack to domestic contentment. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with awe. "May I sit at it?" Harrison nodded, finding himself unexpectedly moved by the boy's careful reverence for the instrument. Ethan settled onto the bench and placed his hands on the keys with the delicate touch of someone who understood that he was in the presence of something precious and powerful. He began to play a simple melody, something Harrison didn't recognize but that sounded hauntingly beautiful in the acoustics of the large room. The music that emerged from the piano was nothing like the mechanical exercises Harrison had expected from a self-taught 12-year-old. Ethan's playing had an intuitive musicality that spoke of genuine talent rather than mere technical competence. His fingers moved across the keys with surprising confidence, finding harmonies and emotional shadings that suggested he possessed an innate understanding of how music could express feelings that words could not capture. When Ethan finished the piece, he looked up at Harrison with shining eyes.
"I can't believe I get to practice on this every day. I promise I'll take good care of it and never do anything to damage it." Harrison felt a strange tightness in his chest as he recognized the fear underlying Ethan's gratitude. This child had learned through bitter experience that good things were temporary and conditional, that adults who seemed generous could withdraw their kindness without warning, that even the most wonderful opportunities came with the constant threat of loss. "Ethan," Harrison said, sitting down in a nearby chair so that he could look directly into the boy's eyes, "I want you to understand something important. This piano belongs to you now, at least for the next 60 days. You don't need to ask permission to play it, and you don't need to worry about taking up too much space or making too much noise. This house is your home during this time, and I want you to feel comfortable using everything in it." Ethan nodded solemnly, but Harrison could see the lingering uncertainty in his expression. Children who had been moved repeatedly between temporary placements learned not to believe in permanence, not to invest too heavily in spaces that might be taken away without notice. It would take time and consistent reassurance before Ethan could truly relax into the idea that he belonged here, even temporarily. "Let me show you to your room," Harrison said, leading Ethan upstairs to the guest bedroom that he had hastily prepared that morning after making his unprecedented courtroom decision. The room had been furnished as a generic space for occasional visitors, with neutral colors and impersonal decorations that revealed nothing about the interests or personality of anyone who might occupy it. Ethan set his single duffel bag on the bed and looked around the spacious room with its private bathroom and large windows overlooking the garden. It was probably larger than some of the apartments he had lived in, certainly more luxurious than any sleeping space he had ever been assigned in his years of foster care placement. "Is this really all for me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All for you," Harrison confirmed. "And if there's anything you need to make it more comfortable, just let me know. We can go shopping for whatever you'd like to personalize the space." Harrison realized as he spoke that he had no idea what kinds of things a 12-year-old boy might want in his bedroom. His own childhood had been spent in boarding schools where personal possessions were limited and individual expression was discouraged, and his adult life had been devoted to professional pursuits that left little room for understanding the desires and interests of young people. That evening they sat together at Harrison's formal dining table and attempted their first meal as temporary housemates. Harrison had ordered takeout from an expensive Italian restaurant, uncertain about his cooking abilities and wanting to make a good impression, but the elegant food seemed oddly out of place for a casual dinner between a middle-aged man and a young boy who had never experienced such culinary sophistication. Ethan ate carefully and politely, using proper manners and expressing gratitude for every aspect of the meal, but Harrison could sense his discomfort with the formal atmosphere. The boy seemed to be performing the role of grateful house guest rather than relaxing into the natural behavior of someone who belonged in the space. "Tell me about your musical background," Harrison said, hoping that focusing on Ethan's interests might help break through the awkward politeness that was keeping them at emotional distance. "How long have you been playing piano?" Ethan considered the question thoughtfully. "I first touched a piano when I was 8, at my third foster home. Mrs. Williams had an old upright in her basement, and she let me play it sometimes when I finished my chores.
but I've only been able to practice regularly since I've been at the Palmers, because the school lets me use their piano during lunch. What draws you to piano specifically? Why not guitar or drums or violin? Piano makes sense to me, Ethan said, his face lighting up as he talked about something he genuinely cared about. You can see all the notes laid out in front of you, and you can play melody and harmony at the same time. When I listen to songs on the radio, I can picture how they would look on piano keys. It's like the music has colors and shapes that translate directly to where my fingers need to go. Harrison found himself genuinely interested in Ethan's description of his musical perception. The boy was articulating something about synesthetic experience that suggested unusual neurological wiring, a kind of natural musical intelligence that couldn't be taught but could potentially be developed into something extraordinary with proper training and support. Have you ever had formal lessons with a teacher? Ethan shook his head. Foster kids don't usually get music lessons. That kind of thing costs money that families are spending on more important stuff like food and clothes and medical bills. I've learned everything just by listening and experimenting. The matter-of-fact way Ethan discussed the economic limitations of foster care made Harrison uncomfortable in ways he wasn't prepared to examine. He had spent his entire adult life in environments where money was never a limiting factor, where children's talents were nurtured through expensive lessons and specialized programs that developed whatever abilities they showed promise in. The idea that genuine talent might go undeveloped simply because of economic circumstances challenged his fundamental assumptions about merit and opportunity. Well, that's going to change, Harrison said decisively. Tomorrow we're going to find you a piano teacher, the best one in the county. If you're going to impress me in 60 days, you're going to need professional instruction to supplement your natural abilities. Ethan's eyes widened with excitement, but then his expression grew thoughtful. How much do piano lessons cost? I don't want to be expensive for you to take care of. The innocent question revealed the financial anxiety that shaped every aspect of Ethan's worldview. This 12-year-old had learned to calculate the economic burden of his own existence, to worry about being too costly for the adults responsible for his care. Harrison realized with a sharp pang of recognition that Ethan's concern about expense was probably the reason he had never asked any of his previous foster families about music lessons, accepting that his dreams were luxuries that practical people couldn't afford to support. Ethan, Harrison said firmly, I want you to stop worrying about money. I have more than enough resources to provide you with whatever you need to develop your musical abilities. Piano lessons, sheet music, books, concerts, whatever it takes. Money is not going to be an obstacle to your success. That night Harrison lay awake in his king-sized bed and listened to the sounds of another person living in his house. He could hear Ethan moving around in the guest room, probably unable to sleep in the unfamiliar environment, and occasionally he caught fragments of melody drifting down from upstairs as the boy hummed quietly to himself. The presence of another human being in his carefully ordered domestic space felt both invasive and somehow necessary, as if the house had been incomplete without voices and movement to fill its empty rooms. Harrison found himself thinking about the magnitude of what he had committed to. 60 days seemed simultaneously too long and too short, too much time to spend sharing his private sanctuary with a virtual stranger, but not nearly enough time to determine whether he and Ethan could build the kind of relationship that might justify permanent legal adoption. He had no roadmap for this experiment, no clear criteria for measuring success or failure, no understanding of what it would mean to become responsible for shaping another person's future. The next morning, Harrison made phone calls to locate the best piano instructor in the region. His legal connections and professional reputation opened doors that might have remained closed to ordinary parents seeking lessons for their children, and by noon he had secured an appointment with Eleanor Michaels, a former concert pianist who taught a select group of advanced students from her home studio in the hills above the city. Mrs. Michaels was a woman in her 70s who had performed with major symphony orchestras before retiring to focus on teaching gifted young musicians. Her studio occupied the entire top floor of her modernist house with two concert grand pianos positioned to take advantage of perfect natural acoustics and panoramic views of the valley below. She had agreed to evaluate Ethan primarily as a professional courtesy to Harrison, whose judicial reputation made him someone worth accommodating.
Judge Blackwood, Mrs. Michaels said when they arrived for the appointment, "I understand you have a young protégé who shows musical promise. How long has he been studying?" "That's what we're here to determine," Harrison replied diplomatically, not wanting to reveal the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. "Ethan is self-taught, but I believe he has significant natural ability that deserves professional assessment." Mrs. Michaels invited Ethan to sit at one of her pianos and asked him to play whatever he felt most comfortable with. Ethan chose the same piece he had played the previous evening, a haunting melody that demonstrated his intuitive understanding of musical phrasing and emotional expression. Mrs. Michaels listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating musical potential, her experienced ear picking up subtleties that revealed both strengths and areas for development. When Ethan finished, Mrs. Michaels sat in thoughtful silence for several moments before speaking. "Young man, you have something quite unusual. Your technical foundation needs work, certainly, but your musical instincts are extraordinary. You hear harmony and rhythm in ways that can't be taught, only refined and channeled." She turned to Harrison with an expression of professional excitement. "Judge Blackwood, this boy has the raw material for serious musical development. With proper instruction and dedicated practice, he could achieve remarkable things. But I must warn you that nurturing this level of talent requires tremendous commitment from both student and family. Are you prepared for that?" Harrison felt a surge of pride hearing Ethan's abilities validated by such a distinguished expert, but he also recognized the weight of responsibility that came with Mrs. Michaels' assessment. If Ethan truly had exceptional talent, then failing to support its development would be more than disappointing, it would be a genuine tragedy. "What would proper instruction look like?" Harrison asked. "For someone with Ethan's potential, I would recommend 3 lessons per week initially, 2 hours of daily practice minimum, and exposure to a wide range of classical repertoire to build his musical vocabulary. He'll need to learn to read music fluently, develop proper technique to prevent injury, and understand music theory to support his intuitive abilities." Mrs. Michaels looked directly at Ethan, who had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement. "Young man, are you prepared to work harder than you've ever worked at anything? Because developing your gifts will require discipline and persistence that most people your age aren't capable of sustaining." Ethan's response was immediate and fervent. "Yes, ma'am, I'll do whatever it takes. This is the most important thing that's ever happened to me." Mrs. Michaels smiled, recognizing the fierce determination that separated truly dedicated students from those who were merely interested in music as a casual hobby. "Then we'll begin tomorrow. Judge Blackwood, I'll prepare a practice schedule and repertoire list that will challenge Ethan appropriately while building the technical foundation he needs." Over the following weeks, Ethan's life transformed into a rigorous routine centered entirely around musical development. He woke at 6 each morning and practiced for 2 hours before breakfast, working through technical exercises and scales that gradually improved his finger strength and coordination. After breakfast, Harrison drove him to school, where Ethan's teachers reported that despite the dramatic changes in his living situation, his academic performance remained consistently excellent. Each afternoon, Ethan rushed home to practice for another 2 hours before Harrison returned from the courthouse. The sound of piano music became the soundtrack of their domestic life, filling the house with melodies that ranged from simple beginner exercises to increasingly complex pieces that showcased Ethan's rapid progress. Harrison found himself looking forward to these daily concerts, often arriving home early so he could listen to Ethan work through challenging passages with the persistence and focus of someone much older. 3 times per week, Harrison drove Ethan to Mrs. Michaels' studio for intensive lessons that pushed the boy's abilities in new directions.
Mrs. Michaels was a demanding teacher who expected excellence and refused to accept anything less than Ethan's best effort. She corrected his posture relentlessly, refined his fingering with military precision, and introduced him to classical composers whose works required technical skills far beyond what he had previously attempted. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Mrs. Michaels announced during their third week of lessons, placing the sheet music in front of Ethan with the air of someone presenting a sacred text. This piece will teach you about romantic expression while developing your left-hand independence. It's challenging for someone at your level, but I believe you're ready to attempt it. Ethan studied the complex notation with intense concentration, his eyes moving across the staff lines as he began to decode the musical language that was still relatively new to him. Reading music had proven to be one of his greatest challenges, since his self-taught approach had relied entirely on ear training rather than visual interpretation of written symbols. "I can hear how it should sound," Ethan said after studying the first page, "but translating that into finger positions is still difficult for me." "That will come with practice," Mrs. Michaels assured him. "Your musical ear is actually an advantage once you learn to connect what you hear internally with what you see on the page. Most students have to develop musical intuition slowly, but you already possess it naturally." At home, Harrison created a practice environment designed to support Ethan's musical development. He had the piano tuned by a professional technician, purchased a high-quality adjustable bench that would accommodate Ethan's growth, and installed additional lighting to ensure that sheet music could be read clearly during evening practice sessions. He even researched optimal room acoustics and made adjustments to furniture placement that would enhance the sound quality of Ethan's practice. But beyond providing material support, Harrison found himself becoming genuinely invested in Ethan's daily progress. He learned to recognize the difference between productive practice and mere repetition, encouraging Ethan to work through challenging passages systematically, rather than simply playing them repeatedly until they became automatic. He purchased recordings of the pieces Ethan was learning, listening to them during his commute to work so he could provide informed feedback about interpretation and expression. Most surprisingly, Harrison discovered that he enjoyed the domestic routines that had developed around their shared project. Making breakfast while listening to Ethan's morning practice had become one of his favorite parts of each day, a peaceful ritual that provided a calm beginning to otherwise stressful judicial proceedings. Evening practice sessions had replaced his solitary dinners and television watching, creating a sense of shared purpose that he had never experienced during his marriage. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Harrison began noticing changes in Ethan that went beyond musical development. The boy's chronic anxiety about placement stability was gradually being replaced by confident engagement with his daily routine. He had stopped asking permission for basic activities like getting snacks from the kitchen or using the living room television, beginning to treat the house as a genuine home rather than a temporary accommodation. Ethan's school reports reflected his improved emotional state as well. His teachers noted that he seemed more confident in class discussions, more willing to participate in group activities, and generally happier than he had appeared during his previous placements. The stability of living with Harrison, combined with the excitement of pursuing his musical passion, had created conditions that allowed Ethan's natural personality to emerge from behind the careful guardedness that had protected him through years of institutional uncertainty. But Harrison also recognized that Ethan's progress was creating pressure on both of them that neither had fully anticipated. Each day brought new evidence of the boy's exceptional musical abilities, making the prospect of their arrangement ending in failure increasingly painful to contemplate. Harrison found himself becoming emotionally invested in Ethan's success in ways that challenged his professional detachment and forced him to confront questions about his own capacity for long-term commitment to another person's welfare. During their 4th week together, Mrs. Michaels made an announcement that surprised both Harrison and Ethan. Judge Blackwood, I've been discussing Ethan's progress with several colleagues who teach at the conservatory level. We all agree that his development has been remarkable, far exceeding what anyone would expect from a student with his limited background. She turned to Ethan with an expression of professional respect. Young man, I believe you should perform in the regional student competition next month. It would provide valuable experience and allow you to measure your abilities against other serious young musicians. Ethan looked both thrilled and terrified by the suggestion. Do you really think I'm ready for something like that? I've only been taking formal lessons for a month. Your musical instincts are mature enough to compete with students who have been studying for years, Mrs. Michaels assured him. The competition would be excellent preparation for your audition with Judge Blackwood, providing you with performance experience under pressure. Harrison felt a complicated mixture of pride and anxiety as he realized that their private challenge was evolving into something with much larger implications. If Ethan performed in a regional competition, their arrangement would become public knowledge, potentially exposing Harrison to professional scrutiny and criticism about his unconventional approach to judicial decision-making. But looking at Ethan's excited expression, Harrison knew that his own professional concerns were less important than supporting the boy's musical development. If Mrs. Michaels believes you're ready, then we should definitely enter you in the competition. That evening, as they sat together reviewing the competition requirements and selecting pieces for Ethan's audition repertoire, Harrison reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 1 month. His orderly bachelor existence had been replaced by a chaotic but rewarding routine centered around another person's dreams and aspirations. His emotional detachment had given way to genuine investment in Ethan's success and well-being. Most significantly, Harrison was beginning to understand that the 60-day timeline he had established was arbitrary and possibly counterproductive. Musical development was not something that could be measured by artificial deadlines, and emotional relationships were not contracts that could be evaluated according to predetermined criteria. Whatever happened at the end of their agreed-upon trial period, Harrison knew that both he and Ethan had already been changed by their time together in ways that couldn't be undone or easily measured. As Ethan practiced the Chopin nocturne that would be the centerpiece of his competition performance, Harrison listened from the kitchen and marveled at the transformation he was witnessing. The tentative, self-taught melodies that had first captured his attention in the school music room had evolved into sophisticated musical expressions that revealed genuine artistic maturity. But even more remarkable than Ethan's musical progress was the emergence of his personality from behind the protective walls that years of foster care had taught him to maintain. The quiet, overly polite boy who had stood in Harrison's courtroom 5 weeks earlier had been replaced by a confident young man who expressed opinions, made jokes, and engaged with the world around him as if he had every right to belong in it. Harrison was beginning to understand that their arrangement had never really been about proving Ethan's musical abilities. It had been about creating conditions where both of them could discover who they might become when given the opportunity to care about something larger than their individual survival. The piano had been the catalyst, but the real transformation was happening in the spaces between the music, in the daily interactions and shared routines that were teaching them both what family could mean when it was chosen rather than imposed by circumstance. With 3 weeks remaining until their official evaluation, Harrison found himself hoping that the regional competition would provide Ethan with the confidence and performance experience that would allow him to demonstrate the full extent of his remarkable abilities. But more than that, he was beginning to hope that their 60-day experiment would prove to be just the beginning of a relationship that could provide them both with the sense of belonging that had been missing from their carefully constructed but ultimately incomplete individual lives. The morning of the regional competition dawned gray and drizzly, with November clouds hanging low over the conservatory building where 12 young pianists would compete for recognition and scholarships. Ethan had barely slept, his mind cycling through the pieces he would perform while his fingers moved silently against his bedsheets, practicing passages that had become as familiar as breathing over the past 6 weeks of intensive preparation. Harrison stood at the kitchen window watching rain streak down the glass while coffee brewed in the machine that had become essential to their early morning routine. The past month and a half had transformed both of them in ways neither had anticipated when they first shook hands in that sterile courtroom. The house felt different now, alive with purpose and shared commitment, filled with the sounds of music and conversation that had replaced years of echoing silence. At the breakfast table, Ethan pushed scrambled eggs around his plate without eating, his usual appetite suppressed by pre-performance nerves. Mrs. Michaels had assured them both that competition anxiety was normal and even beneficial for serious musicians, that the adrenaline would sharpen his focus and heighten his sensitivity to the music. But watching Ethan's pale complexion and shaking hands, Harrison wondered whether they had pushed too hard too fast, asking too much of someone whose emotional reserves had already been depleted by years of institutional instability. "Remember what we discussed about breathing," Harrison said gently, reaching across the table to steady Ethan's trembling coffee cup. "Mrs. Michaels says that controlling your breath is the foundation of controlling everything else during performance." Ethan nodded but remained silent, his dark eyes reflecting an internal struggle between excitement and terror. The competition represented everything he had dreamed of since discovering his musical abilities, but it also carried the weight of their entire arrangement. Success today would validate Harrison's unprecedented decision to invest in his potential, while failure might confirm the skepticism that had greeted their unusual partnership from colleagues and social workers who questioned the judge's judgment. The drive to the conservatory took them through neighborhoods where other families were beginning their Saturday morning routines, parents taking children to soccer games and dance classes, ordinary domestic scenes that reminded Harrison of how far outside normal patterns their relationship had developed. Other judges spent weekends reviewing case files or playing golf with professional associates, not driving foster children to piano competitions that would determine both their futures. Inside the conservatory's elegant lobby, dozens of families clustered around registration tables and bulletin boards displaying competition schedules. The other young performers were easily identifiable by their formal concert attire and the nervous energy that radiated from both children and parents as they prepared for their individual audition times. Harrison felt momentarily out of place in this world of dedicated musical families, uncertain about the protocols and expectations that govern such events. Mrs. Michaels met them near the entrance, her presence providing immediate reassurance to both Harrison and Ethan. She had attended hundreds of these competitions over her decades of teaching, and her calm professionalism helped anchor their anxiety in practical preparation rather than abstract worry. "Ethan," she said, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, "today is simply an opportunity to share your music with people who understand its value. You're not performing for judges who will determine your worth as a person. You're offering a gift to listeners who appreciate the beauty you've worked so hard to create." The competition was divided into age categories, with Ethan scheduled to perform in the intermediate division against 11 other pianists ranging from 10 to 14 years old. Most of his competitors had been studying music since early childhood, their families having invested thousands of dollars in lessons, instruments, and performance opportunities that had shaped their entire educational experience around musical development. Waiting in the warm-up room, Harrison watched Ethan observe the other performers with quiet intensity. A 13-year-old girl with perfect posture ran through technical exercises with mechanical precision, her fingers flying over the keyboard in patterns that suggested years of disciplined training. Twin brothers who appeared to be about Ethan's age took turns at another piano, their synchronized movements revealing the kind of musical sophistication that came from growing up in households where classical music was a living language rather than a foreign tongue. "They're all so good," Ethan whispered to Harrison, his confidence visibly wavering as he compared his relatively limited experience to the obvious expertise surrounding them. "They've had different opportunities than you have," Harrison replied quietly, "but that doesn't make their music more meaningful than yours. Mrs. Michaels chose your competition pieces specifically because they showcase your unique strengths and musical instincts. When Ethan's turn came, Harrison and Mrs. Michaels took seats in the performance hall where three adjudicators sat at a long table with score sheets and evaluation forms. The room was smaller than Harrison had expected, more intimate than the imposing concert halls he had imagined, with perhaps 50 seats for family members and teachers who had come to support their young performers. Ethan walked to the Steinway grand piano positioned in the center of the stage, his formal black suit making him appear older and more serious than his 12 years. He adjusted the bench with the careful attention to detail that Mrs. Michaels had drilled into him, tested the pedals, and placed his hands briefly on the keys before looking up to acknowledge the adjudicators with a slight nod. The first piece on his program was a Bach invention, a technically demanding composition that would demonstrate his developing skills in counterpoint and independent voice leading. As Ethan began to play, Harrison felt his breath catch in recognition of how much the boy had grown as a musician over their weeks together. The tentative, self-taught melodies that had first captured his attention in the courtroom had evolved into sophisticated musical communication that revealed genuine artistic maturity. Bach's mathematical precision flowed from Ethan's fingers with crystalline clarity, each voice in the complex texture maintaining its independent character while contributing to the larger architectural structure of the composition. Mrs. Michaels had chosen this piece to showcase Ethan's natural ability to hear multiple melodic lines simultaneously, a skill that many pianists struggled to develop even after years of formal training. The second piece was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the romantic composition that had challenged Ethan's expressive capabilities and pushed his technical abilities beyond anything he had previously attempted. As the opening melody emerged from the piano with singing tenderness, Harrison realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary happening on the stage before him. Ethan was no longer simply playing notes according to learned patterns. He was inhabiting the music from within, allowing Chopin's emotional landscape to flow through him and emerge as sound that spoke directly to the listeners' hearts. The left-hand accompaniment provided a gentle rhythmic foundation, while his right hand shaped the melody with subtle rubato and dynamic shadings that revealed an intuitive understanding of romantic style that couldn't be taught through technical instruction alone. During the most challenging passage, where rapid ornamental figures threatened to overwhelm less experienced performers, Ethan maintained perfect control while allowing the music's inherent passion to shine through his disciplined technique. Harrison found himself gripping the arms of his chair as he watched this boy who had entered his life through administrative accident transform into a genuine artist before an audience of strangers who were witnessing the emergence of exceptional talent. The final piece was Ethan's own choice, a contemporary composition by an American composer that Mrs. Michaels had suggested to demonstrate his ability to interpret modern musical language. The piece required extended techniques and unconventional chord structures that challenged traditional pianistic approaches, demanding both technical precision and imaginative interpretation. As Ethan navigated the complex rhythms and harmonic progressions that characterized the contemporary style, Harrison marveled at his adaptability and musical intelligence. This child, who had learned his first scales just 7 weeks ago, was now performing repertoire that would challenge college-level music students, not just executing the notes correctly, but investing them with personal meaning and artistic conviction. When Ethan played the final chord and allowed its resonance to fade into silence, the small audience burst into enthusiastic applause that continued longer than protocol usually permitted at such formal events. Harrison found himself on his feet along with Mrs. Michaels and most of the other listeners, acknowledging not just a successful performance, but the privilege of witnessing something genuinely remarkable. The adjudicators conferred briefly before announcing their decision. Ethan had won first place in the intermediate division, earning both a small scholarship for future music study and an invitation to perform at the conservatory's winter recital series. But beyond the official recognition, Harrison could see in the boy's radiant expression that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his own capabilities and potential. During the drive home, Ethan chatted excitedly about the other performers and the adjudicator's comments, his earlier anxiety replaced by confident enthusiasm for future musical challenges. Mrs. Michaels had introduced him to several other teachers and performing opportunities, opening doors to a world of possibilities that he had never imagined might be available to someone from his background. Judge Blackwood, Ethan said as they pulled into their driveway, "Do you think I did well enough today to pass your test? Do you think I impressed you the way you wanted me to?" Harrison turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment, recognizing that this question required more than simple affirmation. The competition had proven beyond any doubt that Ethan possessed exceptional musical talent that deserved continued development and support. But more importantly, their weeks together had revealed character qualities that made the question of adoption about much more than artistic ability. Ethan, Harrison said carefully, "You impressed me long before today's performance. You've shown me what it means to work toward something larger than immediate gratification, to persist through challenges that would defeat most people, to maintain hope and dignity even when circumstances seem designed to crush both." He paused, gathering courage for words that would change both their lives irrevocably. "But more than being impressed by your abilities, I've discovered that I care about your happiness and success in ways that have nothing to do with piano playing. I want to be part of your life not because you've proven yourself worthy of my approval, but because sharing our daily routines and witnessing your growth has made me understand what family actually means." Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he processed the implications of Harrison's words. "Does that mean you want to adopt me for real? Not just because I won the competition, but because you want me to be your son? I want to adopt you because these past weeks have taught me that love isn't something you earn through performance," Harrison said, his own voice breaking slightly. "It's something you discover when you allow yourself to care more about another person's well-being than your own comfort or convenience." Inside the house that had become their shared home, they sat together at the piano where their unlikely partnership had begun. Ethan played the Bach invention that had opened his competition program, but now the music carried different meaning than it had possessed during their weeks of preparation. These were no longer notes being practiced for evaluation by external judges, but sounds that expressed the joy and gratitude of someone who had found not just artistic recognition but genuine belonging. Harrison listened to the familiar melody and realized that his own life had been transformed as completely as Ethan's over their time together. The emotional detachment that had defined his professional identity had been replaced by investment in outcomes that extended far beyond legal proceedings. The orderly solitude that had satisfied him for decades now seemed hollow compared to the rich complexity of sharing daily life with someone whose dreams and disappointments mattered as much as his own. 3 months later, Harrison's courtroom was again filled with observers, but this time they had gathered for an adoption finalization rather than a foster placement hearing. Sarah Chen sat in the front row with a smile that acknowledged how wrong her initial skepticism had been about Harrison's unprecedented offer. Mrs. Michaels attended with several of her colleague teachers who had followed Ethan's remarkable musical development with professional interest and personal investment. Dorothy Palmer was there with her husband, both beaming with pride at the successful resolution of a situation that had seemed impossible when economic circumstances forced them to disrupt Ethan's placement. Even some of Harrison's judicial colleagues had come to witness the ceremony that formalized what everyone could see had become a genuine father-son relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment. When Harrison pronounced the legal words that made Ethan Rivers into Ethan Blackwood, the formal language of adoption proceedings seemed inadequate to capture the emotional significance of what they were acknowledging. Two people who had found each other through institutional accident had discovered that family could be created through choice and sustained through daily acts of care that had nothing to do with biological connection or legal obligation. That evening, at their first family dinner as officially recognized father and son, Ethan played a new composition he had written to commemorate the occasion. The piece began with the tentative, searching melody that represented his years of uncertainty and institutional instability, gradually developing into complex harmonies that expressed the security and belonging he had found in their unlikely partnership. As Harrison listened to music that told the story of their transformation from strangers into family, he reflected on how completely his understanding of success and meaning had been revolutionized by their time together. His judicial career continued to provide professional satisfaction, but it now served a larger purpose of creating conditions where other vulnerable children might discover the same opportunities that had allowed Ethan to develop his remarkable gifts. The piano that had stood silent and forgotten in his living room for nearly a decade had become the center of a home filled with music, laughter, and the daily negotiations that characterized any genuine family relationship. The house that had once showcased his successful solitude now accommodated the beautiful chaos of shared life, with sheet music scattered across expensive furniture and practice schedules coordinated around homework deadlines and social obligations. Most significantly, Harrison had learned that the capacity for love and commitment that he thought he had lost during his failed marriage had actually been waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Ethan had taught him that family was not something you fell into through romantic attraction or biological accident, but something you built through conscious choice and sustained through consistent care for another person's flourishing. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.